until right, perhaps until Labor Day, and I'll check that. So, anyway, welcome back. To kind of refresh where we're at, we have been discussing ancient history, and we're trying to place it in context of the Bible. Uh, Again, I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not a theologian. I'm leaving that to Pastor Dwayne. He'll be talking about the theological aspects of the Bible. I'm trying to place the Bible in terms of the historical context and what was going on out in the world, and trying to give you some insight into that, as well as trying to give you some uh, uh, archaeological evidence to support the Bible. So, 2 weeks ago, when we left off last, we talked about the Hittites, and we learned that the Hittites were relatively a really almost an unknown group of people prior to the 20th century, except for the few mentions in the Bible. And there were about four different mentions in the Bible. We talked about it. We talked about Abraham buying some land for his wife Sarah's tomb. We talked about the fact, of course, probably the one that most of us are aware of is David, where he had Uriah the Hittite killed in order to take his wife Bathsheba. And there were a couple other incidents, but really until the 20th century, as far as we knew, the Hittites were kind of just a minor player in the whole area of Mesopotamia. And then archaeological evidence began to unfold, which gave us information that showed that the Hittites were really an extremely powerful, strong presence in the Mesopotamian river valley between 1500 and 1100 BC. And this primarily happened because of the fact that they developed iron weapons. Uh, Not that they were the first ones to have iron, but they were the ones that really made it a science and was able to do it on a large scale to the point that uh, their weapons were so much vastly superior to all the other area kingdoms. And there, for about a 500-year period, the Hittites were kind of the big dog on the block, particularly up in the Mesopotamian River Valley. And then, of course, we saw in a very large battle with the Egyptians, the Battle of Kadesh. Some people say it's the most documented battle in ancient history, and it was huge. There was like 5 or 6 thousand different chariots involved with it, thousands of men, and all a little bit in doubt. Most people say that probably the Egyptians kind of won the thing. The result was that the Hittites empire began to fall apart, and they were once again conquered and absorbed by the Assyrians, who had already been in power a couple times before. And now the Assyrians come back into power. So that's where we left off. So now today we're going to talk about the Babylonian Empire. Now, by the way, this is the gates of Babylon. They really existed. This is a fire glazed, real formal gate that led into the city that was built by Nebuchadnezzar. And when the European countries were doing their colonial thing back in the 1900, the 1800s, pardon me, the 19th century, they actually dismantled. This is called the Ishtar Gate, named after their primary goddess. And they dismantled this gate and took it to Berlin, the Germans did, and rebuilt Ishtar Gate. Maybe somebody out there has seen them. Yeah. But this is the actual gate itself, and it's a beautiful gate. Like I said, it was made out of fire glazed brick, and it's very, very famous. For the quote today, the Bible quote, and on her forehead was written the name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and averse abominations, Revelation 17:5. Now, if there's any name that resonates in the Bible as a personification of evil, it's got to be Babylon. And we're going to talk about that. Why? But before I do that, of course, I got to share my cartoon for the day. And we've got you know, our little cave boy here showing his family tree. He's got Uncle Andy who had a tail, and Mom and Dad, and Grandpa Bob and Grandma Ross, who were dinosaurs, and against the Jorgensens and the Olsons, which were one-celled organisms. Kind of a funny take upon evolution, obviously. So, what do we know about early Babylon? Well, first of all, Babylon, the city, is mentioned 280 times in the Bible. That's probably as many as almost any city or city state in the Bible. It's a huge presence. Why? Because basically Babylon is the personification of evil to the Hebrew people. Remember, it was the Babylonians which took the ancient prisoner, brought them out of Jerusalem, took them in what was known as the Babylonian captivity. We saw that the other day with when we talked about you know the prophet Isaiah and Hezekiah. So the Bible says God sometimes used Babylonian to punish Israel, but the prophets foretold the Babylon sins would eventually end up in its own destructions, which it did. The earliest mention of Babylon dates from the reign of the Akkadian king Sargon the Great, way back there in the 2300s BC. So Babylon's been around for a while, but it really wasn't that big a deal. It was just kind of a small city. It had a religious significance because it housed one of the primary gods of the Mesopotamian River Valley, god by the name of Marduk. Supposedly that was the city where he was from and where he stayed when he came to Earth. But for the most part, Babylon really wasn't a significant city as such, not like Nineveh or Hattusa, the Hittite Empire, definitely not like Thebes or Memphis over in Egypt, probably not even Jerusalem itself. It was just kind of a small city, a kind of a religious site, but it really didn't have any political power as such. Over by the Assyrian nomadic tribe, which had occupied much of what was known as, hang on here, let me move this. I can't read there we go, by the Amorites. And it was taken over by a nomadic tribe, which occupied much of what was then known as Canaan until it was driven out by other tribes. So what you had here was a bunch of Amorites that moved into the power vacuum left by one of these times when the Mesopotamian River Valley was in such disarray. Remember, I told you it's kind of like a fiery cauldron. It was just kind of it seemed like there was always one tribe or the other breaking, coming to power in the Mesopotamian River Valley. Even though there were three major powers, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and then the Babylonians, for a very short period of time. The first time the Babylonians came to power was in the 1700s. Now, I want you to understand something. If it wasn't for the Bible, I'm not for sure how much we would know about the Mesopotamian River Valley. I mean, about the Babylonians, really. If it wasn't for them, I'm not for sure that we would know just a whole lot about them because the Babylonians really were not in power for very long. They were in power for a very short period of time. First of all, in the 1700s, and then again in the 500s. The first time is called the First Babylonian Dynasty. And we know about it primarily because there was a very strong king, a man by the name of Hammurabi, came to power in Babylon. I would suppose most of you out there have heard the term Hammurabi. Hammurabi, of course, is noted because he left us a very famous law code. And that law code is one of the earliest law codes in the ancient world, and we still have it. This is an artist's rendition of Babylon at its height. This would have been Babylon when it would have been at its greatness around 578 BC or so. So this would have been, it was a huge city by that time, but its power was very short-lived, both under Hammurabi, and later on under another series of kings. So what do we know about Hammurabi? Well, we know that the Assyrian Empire had become real fragmented again about 1700, and Mesopotamia was in one of these power vacuums. And so Hammurabi came to power as the Babylonian king. We know that really, for the most part, he wasn't a real aggressive king. He wasn't real warlike. He spent most of his time rebuilding Babylon to make it into a large city, to improve its defenses. We know that it was located on the major trade routes. And as a result, it became a pretty rich and powerful city here for a while. As its power began to grow, Hammurabi began to expand his power. He began to defeat some of these smaller kingdoms in the Mesopotamian River Valley, like the Mari kingdom and the Elamites to the east. And around 1780 or so, Hammurabi had become kind of the strongest power in the lower Mesopotamian River Valley. Unfortunately, his successors were not as strong, and as soon as he died, the first Babylonian dynasty began to unravel. But he is a significant king because of what he left behind, and that is that code of laws. It's not the earliest code of laws. It may not be the most influential because, again, we probably think of the Mosaic Code as being the most influential, but it is one that is really kind of important to the history of the world. There's not for sure any mention of Hammurabi. Some scholars think that the biblical Amraphel, who was labeled the king of Shinar, mentioned in Genesis 14, was Hammurabi. I'm not for sure about that. Amraphel was one of those kings that supposedly kidnapped Abraham's nephew Lot, and Abraham went out with his fellow soldiers, his fellow tribesmen, and rescued Lot. I'm not really for sure that the time frame fits for Amraphel being Hammurabi. Don't be thrown off by the names. It was very common in ancient history for kings to have various names and obviously to be called different names by different groups of people. So it could be. I'm just not for sure of it. I'm kind of a little bit leery about that mention. Here is a statue of Hammurabi that they've uncovered. So what was this law code that he left that is so famous and so important? Well, first of all, it was described in Akkadian. Remember, the Akkadians were one of those groups of people that had a large influence on the Mesopotamian River Valley, and the Akkadian was kind of the language a lot of people in the Mesopotamian River Valley spoke prior to Aramaic. Well, he had his law code inscribed on a basalt stele, it's a black stone, about 7.5 feet tall, and it was placed in the original, kind of in the public square of Babylon so all could see it. And he basically it was a list of laws that he expected everyone to follow, being the king of Babylon. It was discovered in 1901 when they were excavating the old Persian capital of Susa in present-day Iran, and taken by the French, and now is in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Who knows, maybe somebody here listening to me has seen the Code of Hammurabi. It's very prominent. I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. The law code scope was broad, included criminal, family, property, commercial law. Most historians praised it for its fairness and respect. In fact, we even have a relief portrait of Hammurabi on the United States Capitol. I believe there's also a portrait of him across the United States Supreme Court. So he is considered one of the primary lawgivers of world history. Now, his law code was based on the laws of retribution. That is, if a man broke a law of one of his equals, then he would be punished likewise. For instance, If I was a rich man and I broke a bone of a rich man, then I would have that bone myself broken. Now, one thing you need to understand, it was not an equal set of laws in terms, if I broke the law, if I broke a bone of a poor man, then I could just give him money. So it was based on social classes. Sometimes these punishments were very horrific. For instance, if a pair of scheming lovers that conspired to murder spouses were found, and they would be impaled. So, they were pretty severe laws, to say the least. It also is notable for its trial by ordeal. This became very common in the medieval world. I remember, some of your stories about, the medieval joust and the knights and all, and they often had trials by ordeals. We did the same thing in Salem with the witchcraft. We basically tried to determine their guilt or innocence by giving them some kind of ordeal. They would be placed the accused would be placed in a deadly situation, and if they failed, then they were obviously guilty. The laws were not always equally fair, and so that's something that you need to be aware of. But at least they were written down. That's an important step, that didn't come about very often in the ancient world. Most of the times, laws were oral. It surprisingly did contain a doctrine of innocent until proven guilty, which is one of the cornerstones of the Western laws that we have in the world today. The burden of proof was actually placed on the accuser. So if the accuser accused you of a crime, then it was his burden to prove it to you. You didn't have to prove your innocence. They had to prove your guilt. That's a pretty important thing. And that's one of the reasons that the Code of Hammurabi is so important to us in the modern world. This is the actual law code of Hammurabi. It's in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And you can see it's about 7.5 feet tall. And along with many of the other great treasures of the ancient and modern world, it's one of those that are located there in that museum. Now, after Hammurabi died, Babylon was ruled by a series of what we called Kassites. Kassites were an Indo-European tribe that came out of the Zagros Mountains. That's that group of mountains between Iraq and Iran, which have played such an important part in the history of those two countries. And the Kassites were not very strong. So the result was that they were basically vassal kings. The Hittites would be in charge of them, and then the Elamites, and then the Assyrians, and so forth. So basically, until about, approximately about 600 BC, Babylon kind of fell back into being just a small city of no importance except for being a religious shrine. It was sacked many times. And while it retained its religious importance, as I've said, it really didn't have any political or military power. The supposed end of Babylon was thought to have occurred originally in the 600s when Sennacherib, that old Assyrian king, came to Babylon, placed his son upon the throne of Babylon, but he was kind of rejected. The result was that he took the statue of their great god Marduk and took it out and took it back to Nineveh. And at least the people of Babylonia and the people of the Mesopotamian River Valley felt like this was the undoing of Sennacherib, because sure enough, Sennacherib was eventually killed and the Assyrian Empire fell apart. A lot of people think it was because, at least back in those days, they thought it was because Sennacherib had disrespected this god, this Marduk, which was a huge god in the Mesopotamian River Valley. He also destroyed the city because he was so upset with the Babylonians. So by around 680 AD BC or so, Babylon was completely in ruins. But then it began to be rebuilt. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, we talked about him the other day, rebuilt the city of Babylon, returned the statue in order to kind of try to make amends. And the result was that the Babylonians once again began to rise in power. So much so that by 612, an alliance of the Babylonians, a group of people called the Chaldeans, the Medes, and others, finally grew strong enough that they were actually able to attack the city of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in 612 and destroyed him. And of course, this is recorded in the Bible. Nineveh was right up there with Babylon as being an evil city, mainly because the Assyrians, whose capital was at Nineveh, had been the ones that had taken capture the northern kingdom of Israel, with the capital city at Samaria. So 612 BC, Nineveh is destroyed. The prophet Nahum says, King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber, your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? Nahum 3:18 and 19. So Assyria is no more. Now Babylon is once again risen to power as the big dog in the Mesopotamian River Valley. This led to what we know as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire. So this is a painting of the destruction of Nineveh by the Babylonians. So now the Babylonians have once again risen to power. And we know just a whole lot about the Babylonians because their interaction with the Hebrew people was extremely strong because of the fact that they were the ones that took the Hebrew people captive and basically installed what became known as the Babylonian captivity. The primary king of the period of time we're talking about, from about 634 to about 562, was a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is just all over the Bible. So Nebuchadnezzar II is actually the most famous king. He had a lot of problems on his hand, but he was really involved in rebuilding the city of Babylon into one of the greatest cities of the ancient times. So he spent a lot of his time and a lot of his efforts rebuilding the city of Babylon, which had been basically destroyed by the Assyrians. He rebuilt the royal palace, he repaired the temples, he built a bridge over the Euphrates, he built this grand processional boulevard with a set of gates that I showed you right at the beginning, with glazed bricks. Probably the thing he's most famous for, as far as his building, was the building of what's called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story goes, at least, that he'd married a Median wife from those Zagros Mountains between Iraq and Iran today. And she had been raised up in an area that was full of green hills and trees, and she was very much used to that kind of homeland, kind of like me. I've been fortunate to have been raised in the Ozarks, which has an abundance of green trees and valleys and hills. And apparently Nebuchadnezzar took her out of that and took her into Babylon, which, if you know anything about Mesopotamia, you know by this time it was kind of a brown, arid wasteland. It wasn't the most beautiful part of the world. And apparently she became extremely depressed, the story goes, and he decided to build her a palace. And he built her a terraced palace, which had different levels. And he planted trees and brush, bushes. He built waterfalls, and it was so magnificent that it was later on named by Herodotus, the old ancient Greek historian, as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, along with the pyramids and lighthouse of Rhodes and some of these other famous things that we know about from our ancient history. Here's the problem. There is no archaeological evidence to support that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually existed. We don't know if it really happened or not. We do know that Sennacherib, the Assyrian king that we've talked about, did build a city with hanging gardens, in Nineveh. And some people think that Herodotus maybe got his history messed up. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Um, but the point of it is that that's one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar has became most famous for. The other thing, of course, is the fact that he is the king that took the Hebrew people captive, destroyed Jerusalem, tore down Solomon's temple in 586, and basically took them captive and brought them back to Babylon, or at least the leaders and the wealthy. He left the low people there, the common people like me. I would have not been taken to Babylon. I would have been left in Jerusalem to fend for myself had I lived back in those days. So this was what was known as the Babylonian captivity. Here's his artist's rendition of what he thinks that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon would have looked like. We have no idea. We just know what Herodotus, how they described them. So somebody painted a painting of what he thinks they might have looked like. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Who knows? So, what does the Bible say about Nebuchadnezzar? Now, again, I want to emphasize, had it not been for his interaction with the Hebrew people, I'm not for sure that we would know that much about Babylon. Babylon really wasn't a very big power for very many years. And they really, weren't just a big, huge power like Assyria or even the Hittites. But because of their interaction with the Hebrews and their, the almost constant mention of them in the Bible, we know a lot about them. And so that's good for us as historians. The story of Nebuchadnezzar is told in detail in 2 Kings, the 24th and 25th chapter. If you go back, get your Bible and read the 24th and 25th chapter, 2 Kings, it's going to tell you all about Nebuchadnezzar. We know, for instance, that when Josiah became king of Judah, that was the southern kingdom, and repudiated the evils of his grandfather Manasseh. Manasseh was supposedly, according to the Bible, the most evil king of Judah that had ever lived. He had restored pagan practices. Well, apparently Josiah became king, and he restored all, the Passover feast. He destroyed the pagans. He killed the priests. And it says in 2 Kings 23rd chapter that neither before or after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did. Well, that was the setting for Nebuchadnezzar coming to Jerusalem. The next three kings again restored the pagan practices. And after the last king, a king by the name of Zedekiah, came to power, he refused to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. This was a very common thing for basically a king like Nebuchadnezzar to say, I won't attack you, but you send me gold and silver annually and anything else that I desire. Well, Zedekiah refused to do this. And the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem, and it finally fell in 586 BC. We know that. It's talked about in the Bible. We know it from other records. It says he set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, all the houses of Jerusalem, broke down the walls of the city, and carried the people who remained in the city into exile. The 2 Kings 24th chapter, 9 through 11 verses. Now, there's no doubt this happened. This is called the second diaspora of the Jewish people. The first one was when the Assyrians took the northern kingdom captive. And the last one, of course, occurred when the Romans finally destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD after a revolt and just basically tore down Solomon's temple. There's a second temple that was rebuilt by Hezekiah and was just basically just, completely destroyed the city. So we hear more about Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. Daniel, the book of Daniel, is also a very important book in terms of talking about Nebuchadnezzar. We know that Daniel was taken captive and he was made a servant to the king Nebuchadnezzar. Again, this was not uncommon for a king to capture people, and if there was someone there that had certain powers or gifts like prophecy or maybe they were very learned people, they would often keep them enslaved and make them part of the court and use their talents. Well, Daniel apparently had a talent for prophecy. And if you read Daniel, second and third chapters, it talks all about Nebuchadnezzar, and he talks about how Daniel got in trouble with Nebuchadnezzar, and he and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, got thrown into a fiery furnace. And unfortunately for Nebuchadnezzar, he finds out that it doesn't do any good because they're walking around in the fiery furnace along with the fourth individual, who we assume from reading the book of Daniel must have been Jesus. And he lets him out, and he makes retribution. He's sorry. He does all this, and then he calls Daniel into his presence and says, "I've had dreams. I want you to basically interpret my dreams." And Daniel's interpretation of his dreams are not what he wants. The result was that Nebuchadnezzar becomes like a wild animal. The Lord strikes him, and he basically lives like a wild animal for 7 years, and then he's brought back to power and dies. Then he is eventually dies, and Daniel is brought before the new king, Belshazzar. And Belshazzar's made a big mistake. He decides to have a big meal, and while he's having this meal, he's using the goblets and a bunch of the stuff that had been stolen from the temple, Solomon's temple. And they're kind of mocking the Hebrews and the Hebrew God and all the and I can't remember exactly. Interpret this, and Daniel says, "Yes, I can." What it says is that you're going to die this very night, and your kingdom is going to disappear. And sure enough, Belshazzar dies that night, and within a matter of weeks, the Babylonian Empire is taken over by the Persians. And this is when we have the Persians involved with Daniel, because Daniel is still captive. Daniel, again, is noted as a prophet, and he refuses to pray to the Persian gods. And so they throw him into a lion's den. The Persians do. And the king, Darius, was not happy about this because he had a feeling not all was good about this. He rushes down to the morning and hears Daniel walking around unhurt, looking up at Darius and said, "Hey, I'm fine. Nothing here to see. God's protected me." Well, eventually, of course, Darius brings him back out. He makes Daniel a huge prophet in the court. And, Daniel becomes a big presence in the Persian government. Darius eventually dies. And according to the book of Ezra, his son Cyrus takes over, Cyrus the Great, the greatest of all the Persian kings. We're going to hear a lot more about Cyrus when we talk about the Greeks. Finally listens to Daniel, and he is a very benevolent king, and he decides that, because of all the favors that have been shown him, that he is going to return the Hebrew people that want to return and let them rebuild their temple. And so this is when you have the return of the Hebrew people to Jerusalem and the building of the second temple, as described in the book of Ezra. So this is the interaction between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and the Cyrus the Persian king, as talked about in the book of Daniel and the book of Second Kings and the book of Ezra. Now, the big dream that got Daniel in trouble was this. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and this dream was that he dreamed of a huge man and a statue, and it had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thigh of bronze, legs of iron, but the feet were iron and clay mixed. Well, everybody had an idea what this was about, but they were scared to tell Nebuchadnezzar. So that's when he brings Daniel in, and Daniel interprets the dream for him. And basically, the dream is this: the gold head represents Nebuchadnezzar, he said. He told Nebuchadnezzar, "You're the head of gold, but your kingdom is going to be replaced by one of silver." And most people assume that was the Persian Empire. And he said, but that kingdom will also be disappeared, and it will be replaced by one of bronze. Most people think this is Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire, which did indeed conquer the Persians. And then he said that kingdom in turn will disappear and be conquered by one of the greatest kingdoms in the whole ancient world, which was the kingdom of iron, which of course is the Roman Empire. And it took over for many hundreds of years. But he said that too will eventually fall apart. And then he gives some prophecy about 10 different kings, which people, he goes into prophetic things about the end time of the world. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream is very important to our theology about the end times. People aren't very clear about what it means. And again, I'm going to leave that to theologians. I'm going to leave that to Pastor Dwayne on Thursdays to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream for you when he gets to it, in terms of what it means theologically. But this is the dream. Now, after Babylonian falls apart, the Persians take over, and that's where we're going to go into next week. The Nebuchadnezzar is gone. Eventually, the Persians take it over. The king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, laid siege to Babylon, and he was able to take it over because he was able primarily to divert the water under the Babylonian walls, and his troops just kind of walked in and took the city over without very much bloodshed at all. This is according to history. He did indeed take the hand of Marduk, which was this old ceremony that supposedly if you were going to rule Babylon, you had to pay homage to their great god, and he did this. And Cyrus is kind of as I mentioned, was kind of a god of mercy, or pardon me, a king of mercy. And he wasn't a real evil king in terms of being, killing all of his captives and all. And he was so impressed with the Hebrew people Daniel, that he ends up letting the people of the Hebrews go. And says Cyrus' restoration to the Jews recorded in Ezra. Any of his God's people among you may go to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. Ezra chapters 1 and 3. So that brings us up to the Persians. So next week, we're going to talk about the Persians, because the Persians, again, had some interaction with the Hebrew people. They're not mentioned as prominently as the Babylonians are, because the Babylonians are the personification of evil to the Hebrew people. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about them because the Persians, up to this point, end up having the greatest empire in ancient history. That would be, of course, overtaken by Alexander the Great, just as Daniel prophesied, and later the Roman Empire. But at least for that period of time, the Persians had the greatest empire in ancient history. So that's where we're at today. I hope you've learned some things about what was going on along with Daniel, kind of see how Daniel fits into the whole historic scheme of the ancient world, along with the other Hebrews and Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus the Great. So next week, the Persians. I appreciate you being with me, and hope you've learned something. It's a beautiful day here, sunny in the 70s. I know there's a whole lot of people in the United States would love to have our weather today. It's just really a great place. So that's it. Thank you for being with us. I hope you stay with us for the upcoming weeks when we talk about some of the other groups of people.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Okay, thank you, Kaylin.
Bye-bye.
Next week.
We'll see you next week.